After finishing my Castle Escape Room map, I played Zelda Breath of the Wild, which inspired me to create something similar in Minecraft. I drew inspiration from the overall vibe, such as ancient ruins and enemy camp mechanics. I viewed it as a challenge and wanted to see if I could develop a comparable experience using only command blocks. While I realized that data packs or mods would have been better options, I thrive on creative constraints and was determined to use command blocks exclusively. I wouldn't consider myself an expert, so there may be better or faster methods to achieve my goals, but that misses the point of this project, which is to challenge myself. I envisioned how the gameplay would unfold, and it didn't seem too difficult to accomplish. I knew from the start that adventure mode would be my foundation. While you can't break blocks, you can still use chests, crafting tables, etc. I had to work within the limits of adventure mode. I knew I could create tools and items that allow interactions with blocks, as in survival mode using commands, so that part was covered. Before searching for a seed, I wanted to test some mechanics I had in mind. I typically create a flat world to experiment before implementing features in my final map. I wanted tools that would allow players to farm, cut down trees, and perform other basic Minecraft tasks usually done in survival mode. Creating basic tools to test these mechanics was relatively easy. A pickaxe would mine resources, an axe would fell trees, and shears would harvest plants, mushrooms, and honey. However, this led to my first problem: cutting down trees without the ability to stack or build up. This realization highlighted a general flaw I had with an adventure mode map: getting stuck in holes and struggling to navigate the overworld and caves. Initially, I thought of implementing a command trigger that would spread the player a certain number of blocks when they got stuck, but that could be exploited in certain situations. Eventually, I concluded that I needed to incorporate tools to help players navigate. This is where ladders and scaffolding came into play. What began as a solution for cutting down trees evolved into a vital game mechanic for navigating the map. I created ladders and scaffolding that can be placed in adventure mode, allowing placement on every naturally generated block I could think of. By restricting placement on certain blocks, I could design areas in the world that couldn't be climbed or griefed. Now I could cut down trees and farmland, but using the shears I commanded into the world, they would only drop wheat seeds that couldn't be placed in adventure mode. So I implemented a setup to detect when wheat seeds spawn in the map. When they do, they are destroyed and replaced by a wheat seed I created that can be placed in adventure mode. I accomplished this using item tags. Once I had the wheat seeds working, I applied the same method to every crop and then moved on to plants, mushrooms, and other harvestable items. Minecraft has many items, so I couldn't cover them all, perhaps in future updates if there's enough demand. With farming and harvesting addressed, I turned my attention to enemy camp mechanics. I had an idea in my head, which I assumed would be easy to implement, but when I put it together, it worked fine until... My concept was to use a tag on the player to trigger enemy summoning in specific areas. The summoned enemies would also have a tag, and when the summoned enemies were removed with that specific tag, it would tag the player as having defeated the camp. This worked well in my tests, and I moved on to finding a suitable seed. However, my tests failed to account for what happens when the player dies or logs off. This would become a future me problem. Initially, I didn't think about making it an island, but I wanted a relatively small map, compared to most Minecraft maps anyway, for better control and to simplify treasure placement and general activities. While browsing online for suitable seeds, I found this island seed. As soon as I saw it, I created a new world. It was perfect for my needs and inspired the island theme. This also allowed me to establish world borders beyond the island, enhancing immersion. The seed turned out to be fantastic. There are nearby villages, cave access to deep underground, and a deep dark biome, along with lush caves throughout. I even discovered several zombie spawners hidden in the nearby mountains. I knew that when I made my actual map, I wouldn't generate structures, but this could serve as a good map in survival. With my seed and basic mechanics in place, I wanted to enable keep inventory, but also introduce some pressure to avoid dying. In my previous survival RPG map, I gave players effects based on their XP level. I adopted a similar approach in this map, resetting the XP upon death like in survival mode. While this was acceptable, I wanted to add additional pressure to discourage death. I decided to use emeralds as currency, so I devised a mechanic to remove all emeralds upon death and summon an item when the player died, storing the amount of emeralds they had. This turned out to be more challenging than I anticipated. I set up a scoreboard to track deaths and another to track how many emeralds the player had upon death. When the player dies, it adds 1 to the death scoreboard, removes the emeralds, and stores the amount in a separate scoreboard called emeralds. I wanted only the player who dropped the item to be able to pick it up, so I needed a way to differentiate between players and link them to the appropriate item, which I eventually called a Soul Emerald. I decided the best approach was to create a false player or dummy player. This allowed me to store a scoreboard value that remained constant on a world level, not just a player level. I created a player called Custom and assigned it a scoreboard value called Custom Number, starting at 0. I set it up so that whenever a new player joined, the map would add 1 to the dummy player's score and store that as the new player's custom number score. This way, each new player would have a unique custom number assigned. I then linked that custom number to the Soul Emerald the player dropped, ensuring that the only player with the same custom number could pick it up. I allowed players to have 3 different Soul Emeralds simultaneously using different scoreboards and tags. Once that was functional, I needed a way for players to collect their emeralds again. I established a location where players could throw their Soul Emeralds, which would detect them and summon emeralds based on that score. I chose to summon a lever when detecting a Soul Emerald, allowing players to trigger a lightning bolt that destroys the emerald and activates the other command blocks to summon the emeralds. At this stage, I had a map with some mechanics, but nothing was installed yet. I started with the enemy camps, thinking they would be the easiest. I installed the first camp and tested it. As soon as I checked what happens when the enemy camp defeated a player, I realized this would not be as straightforward as I anticipated. When the player respawns in a bed, it no longer detects the enemies, even though they are still alive, and erroneously grants the player the defeated camp tag. I also wanted to see what occurred when the player logged out, and a similar issue arose. I eventually switched to a scoreboard-driven mechanic as I wanted them to respawn after a set number of in-game days. Each player starts with a score of 0 for each camp. If a player triggers a camp, their score increases by 1. If that player moves more than 100 blocks away, the camp score resets to 0 and the mobs are killed. If the player defeats the mobs, it stores the camp score as 2, preventing the camp from triggering again. Using a daylight sensor, I set it up to add 1 to each player's camp score if they have 2 or more when the sun rises. After 6 endgame days, the score resets to 0, allowing the camps to spawn again. What I thought would be simple ended up taking the longest to figure out. Often, trial and error is the best way to resolve issues, but I finally got it working. I completed the rest of the enemy camps, XP level effects, Soul Emerald mechanics, and seed plant replacement without much difficulty. I then created a master level using scoreboard objectives that doesn't reset like the XP level does. This was based on objectives like how long the player has been on the map, how much the player has sprinted, and how many mobs the player has killed. When the player reaches a certain threshold on each objective, I add a 1 to a pre-level scoreboard and reset the objective to 0. When a player's pre-level score reaches 12 or more, I add 1 to their level and reset the score. I had a similar system in my survival RPG and found it appealing. Around this time, Minecraft updated to 1.21 and altered command blocks. This change rendered my map and all my work unusable if I wanted to keep it current. I could have decided to keep it as a pre-1.21 map, but I wanted to add new features, which was quite disheartening. I actually stopped working on it entirely for over a year. A year later, I regained the motivation to update my command blocks for the new version. The main challenge was the seed item replacement system I had implemented. Commands no longer recognized the NBT data I initially set up, requiring changes to the NBT data for each item. This was time-consuming, and I had to read extensively about how the new update handled command block NBT data. However, after about 2 days of work, I successfully restored functionality for the newest update. I had previously created tools to work in adventure mode, but needed to allow players to obtain them. I began working on villager shops next. I designed several villagers to sell the tools I created for adventure mode, along with the ladders and scaffolding, as well as other useful items. Additionally, I set up villager shops that would buy crops and meat for emeralds, enabling players to earn a living farming on the map. I constructed the village and integrated the daylight sensor I had previously created for the camps into the roof of one of the houses. I also decided that villagers would only be present during the day, so I used the initial daylight sensor set up to teleport villagers, targeted by tags, below the map at night. Next, I focused on the inn. I wanted to incorporate an inn mechanic in my village. While not necessary, I was curious to see if I could achieve it. I set up a house that couldn't be accessed in adventure mode, containing a bed inside. I then established a villager who would be teleported there at night, selling a bed with a specific tag. When the map detects the player possessing that item, they will be teleported into the room with the bed. After sleeping, the map will teleport the player back out. Next were the plots. I had experimented with switching game modes in previous maps and decided to upgrade my method for this one. Instead of using a repeating command block in the middle and the distance target, I opted for the DX, DY, and DZ to specifically target the area. This provided much more control and resolved issues I encountered with my previous map. The previous method sometimes failed to revert to survival when it should have. This new approach resolved that problem. I could specify which players' game modes to affect by tag, so I needed a way to tag players when they purchased a plot. My solution was to have a villager sell a specific item, a compass, with a designated tag. When the player has that item in their inventory, the map tags them, granting access to the plot. I like the idea of having a compass point to a purchased plot, so I made the villager sell a compass connected to a lodestone. Now I needed to make the map more dangerous. I decided to use monster spawners, as they provide significant control over what spawns and how often. I ensured they spawned with persistence off, preventing them from accumulating. I thought it'd be interesting for mobs like polar bears, wolves, and bees to attack players immediately instead of only when provoked. Making them spawn aggressively was straightforward, but there was no way to spawn them already angry at a player. I had to use a command block to make them target the closest player's UUID. I didn't realize at the time that this would make the mobs persistent. I first noticed this with the bees when they failed to despawn. I considered removing them entirely, but ultimately decided to manually despawn them by spawning them with a tag and teleporting that tag when they moved more than 120 blocks away. I haven't yet mentioned how I handled removing mobs and moving villagers. I prefer not to use a kill command because mobs typically dropped items when killed. My solution was to teleport them below the map into the void at world spawn and use a repeating command block to kill everything except players teleported there. The drops will fall into the void. While I could simply let them drop, some mobs don't fall immediately, and the void takes time to eliminate them. For the villagers, I teleport them below the map at night. They're invulnerable, so they won't be killed. I have several villagers with trades that can only be used once, making it essential to move them rather than kill and replace them. Before implementing the boss fight and adding treasure, I needed to create unique items. I've always loved the idea of a feather that grants levitation when held, so that was my first creation. By using item tags, I can detect when a player holds the item and grants them levitation. There's another command block that clears the effect when the item is removed from their hand. I previously made a snowball that acts like a grenade for my Calico escape room, so I implemented something similar. These do not cause actual explosions. Instead, they detect when a mob is within a certain range and display an explosion particle, play the explosion sound, and inflict instant damage on the mob. For the next item, I wanted an arrow that summons lightning upon hitting a mob. I chose the spectral arrow as I thought it looked the coolest. Unfortunately, spectral arrows don't function the same way as snowballs. I can't target a flying arrow with a tag, only the generic arrow. I almost considered removing it entirely until I decided to eliminate spectral arrows altogether. This enabled me to target every spectral arrow as a specialty arrow and summon the lightning. I set up a similar mechanism to the wheat seeds but did not spawn a new one, so whenever it detects spectral arrows on the map, it destroys them. I also removed them from the crafting recipe. The last specialty item I wanted was one that renders players invisible to mobs. I achieved this by detecting when a player holds a zombie head. When this occurs, the command adds the player to the same team as the mobs, which I set up when summoning. Friendly fire is turned on, so entities on the same team won't attack each other. I considered detecting it as a head item, but I didn't want players to wield a sword or tool while being invisible. This was an easy workaround. I knew I didn't want to eliminate crafting entirely, as I wanted to maintain some semblance of survival Minecraft. I also didn't want players to craft tools that wouldn't work, like axes and shears. These had to be summoned by a command block or sold through a vendor I set up. I contemplated checking every player's inventory for those items and replacing them with summoned ones, but that would be too much work. Instead, I enabled limited crafting, provided players with all recipes, and then removed the ones I didn't want them to have. To detect new players, I have a repeating command block that triggers whenever a player lacks a specific tag. It stores the custom tag, sets up the appropriate scoreboards for the player, removes the specified recipes, and assigns a player tag. The next task was the wither fight. I used a similar mechanic to the camps, but instead of distance triggering the fight, I used a lever and a nether star. This Nether Star is an item I summoned to never despawn and that cannot be picked up. When the lever is pulled, the lightning destroys it and summons the Wither and the mobs in the tower. If a player moves more than 100 blocks from the Wither, the mobs and Wither will be removed. Upon defeating the Wither, players receive the zombie head item and unlock a room containing an end portal, Nether portal, and a villager selling enchanted items. Also summon the Wither again by placing the Nether Star you received on the block and pulling the trigger. Finally, I flew around placing treasure and building little abandoned camps. The most challenging part was ensuring that treasure in caves was accessible from the overworld, as you can't dig in adventure mode. Once I was satisfied with the results, I backed it up, deleted the player data, and released it to the world. I believe there's still much to tweak and add, but I'm content with this being the first playable version. I understand it's not perfect and may contain some bugs, but I can't discover them without players. If you followed along this far, I truly appreciate it and would love for you to try the map and share your thoughts. Links in the description below. Thanks for watching.